Okay, so with that, I will go ahead and welcome you all formally to this Methods Monday session here on Monday, October 24th, 2022. I'm delighted to welcome Ziad Al Achkar to join us for a session on NVIVO and content analysis. And Ziad has asked if you are not one of the Carter School folks that he already knows, please put in the chat a hello and what your interests are or where you're coming from, so he knows the audience we have here. Ziad is a PhD candidate at the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution and a research associate with the Better Evidence Project. Ziad's research focuses on the use of digital technologies and remote sensing by humanitarian and peacebuilding organizations. And Ziad looks at the role that data collection and surveillance plays in this sector and how to develop and design responsible and ethical practices. And really delighted, Ziad, to welcome you today for this 1-hour session on NVIVO and content analysis. So over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan, for this lovely introduction. And thank you for all for joining on a Monday morning or Monday at noon. And as Susan noted, I'm a PhD candidate hoping to, in a final process of finishing my dissertation. And so I've had to, go through a process of collecting data, analyzing my data, making sense of it all. And part of the work that I did, large chunk of my research and data collection was done through interview data. And so as I was looking for ways in designing my approach, I was looking for software or tools where I could make sense of my data from a macro level, but also be able to dive into it. And NVIVO was one of those tools where I had exposure to through the Carter School, through some of the classes, as well as some other similar systems. So if you've ever done, there's MaxQDA, there's QMiner, there's other forms of content analysis tools and systems where you could do similar things, where you can go through your documents, your sources qualitatively, and analyze them and code them and organize them. And the reason I end up really using NVIVO is one, some of the functionalities of NVIVO is really intuitive and helpful, and it takes a little bit of time to get set up, but once you get going, and we'll go through some of this process today, it's an easy way to organize your data, as long as you kind of build the categories early on and code as you go. And the second thing is there's functions that I'm still learning on NVIVO that help do some of this stuff, perhaps in an automated way, and which is a new and exciting way of kind of being able to go through some of this data qualitatively and analyze text. My dissertation part of the data collection, I interviewed 35 people formally and a handful off the record, so their interviews are not recorded here, which you'll see a little bit later on. But interestingly, more and more work is being done on being able to kind of analyze a large-scale amount of data and large-scale amount of reports. And I'll showcase today a little bit in 1 or 2 reports how NVIVO does this, and how some of these autocode functions can help kind of identify main themes within like large-scale reports. And so what I'll do today is I'll start sharing my screen and actually show you the NVIVO software, and I've preloaded. And if you can't see, just you drop a note in the chat. And so what I've done is I've preloaded a couple of documents into NVIVO, and this is kind of what the basics of the software is. I'm using NVIVO 12 Plus, which has just a couple of more capabilities that I thought was going to be necessary for my own research, some of which is some of the automated tools. The nice thing about also NVIVO is that you're able to add in your kind of file repository a bunch of different types of documents. And so for me, mostly I've done is text documents, which come off something like this. You can also do PDF, which is very helpful, if you're doing large-scale literature reviews. You can also do through NVIVO videos, you can do images, you can do audio files. NVIVO has an add-on tool, which is a transcription function. And so if you're doing a lot of audio recording and interviews or relying on audio data, it could also be filtered in, and you can be kind of coding through as you go. For the purposes of today's kind of session, what I figured I would do is show you, at least from my experience, a couple of different ways to use NVIVO, and kind of just the system and how you go through kind of coding and what does coding mean and how does it look like functionally here. Some of the ways you can then aggregate the data, and I'll load up, and towards the end of this, I'll load up my own data and show you kind of an aggregated function and how you can visualize some of the stuff. In this case, I just picked up a couple of kind of open source documents. So this is one interview that was done with the now, well, he was the chief of ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross. And the reason I picked it up is that a lot of times NVIVO gets used for qualitative interviews like I'm doing. And one of the nice things about NVIVO is that sometimes when you're coding or doing interviews, you'd like to be able to just focus on and seeing the text only of the person you interviewed, rather than seeing the questions. So one of the things you can do, or maybe actually let me step back maybe a little bit before we get to that. Let me just kind of go over maybe a little bit kind of the functions and different things you're seeing on the screen before we dive into some exercise or some actual practice. And so you'll see on the left side of the screen, you do have kind of this quick access kind of menu, this data box, codes, cases, and then a bunch of different categories like your notes, the search bars, maps, and outputs. Really, maps or outputs are used kind of after you've done the process of coding. So files are really just the data really that you're using. And so in this case, we have 4 different documents, 2 PDFs, and 2 kind of text-based documents that I copy-pasted off the internet. NVIVO lets you import in different variety of different ways. You can import, if you're a Zotero user, you can import kind of resources from Zotero or Mendeley or EndNote. You can also link to SPSS or Excel spreadsheets. You can kind of also use it if you're doing surveys and you want to analyze some of the surveys through NVIVO. And so you can link to existing surveys that you have, or whether it's on SurveyMonkey or on Qualtrics. And then you can import your standard text files or PDF, which is the case that I've done, as well as you can import images, as I said, or audio or video. It gets a little bit wonky when you're trying to upload a lot big files. So if you're looking to do a video, it might take a few minutes, if not a little bit more, to kind of be added to the system. And then as you go into the process, it might take time. And then NVIVO has this also add-on function called NCapture, which allows you to capture, to be able to record websites or record things on the web. We won't dive into this. This is a little bit complicated, and it's not as easy to do while sharing also a screen. And so really what, from my experience, has been really helpful is to be able to do the text analysis using NVIVO. And as I was noting earlier, one of the things that you can do in NVIVO is build different kind of different classifications. So you would want, for example, in my case, as I was interviewing people, I wanted to, for lack of a better term, classify them and say, this is a person who works for this type of organization. And what you can do is build these kind of case repositories, and I'll show you as we go through. So in this interview, for example, one of the nice things you can do with documents here is you can code them as you go and edit them as need be. And so typically what you want to do, especially if you're doing research on sensitive data where people's information and names aren't here, you wouldn't want to have like Heba Ali or Peter Mara's name. You would say interviewee 1 and then maybe your name. But in this case, this is public. So so I'll show you quickly. One of the things you can do is we can use these kind of autocode functions to kind of sort through the different people that you want to then go through and code their data in an interview. A nice thing about NVIVO is that some of these autocode functions let you do a bunch of different things. Later on, I'll show you how to kind of auto code and look for seams in a PDF file. But for this first step, I want to be able to just show and distinguish between the person being interviewed, in this case, Peter Maurer, and the person who is conducting the interview, Heba Ali from the New Humanitarian. And so you'd kind of go through your documents. You want to make sure it's cleaned up originally so that you have the name of the person and then the text of their response or whatever it may be. You'd go and click on kind of the speaker name function, and then you would write down the name as you see. And so in this case, we'll write Peter Maurer first off. When you do for the first time, it's going to select all the text, and this is kind of a quirk of it, which is why when you want to do speaker names, you only need at least 2 so that you can divide the names properly. And so the second one would do Heba Ali. And then you'll see automatically the system will recognize that there's different people talking. And at every break, whenever the name shows up of Heba Ali, then the next paragraphs are the text to be associated with that individual. We go through and click the next function. And then we can choose how to classify the individual. And so NVIVO typically has already kind of built in 2 different functions of classification. They have a built-in function of organization or person. We can add and create as many classification as need be for your own research. And so in this case, these are people. So we're just going to click the person one. And then the system automatically generated, and you can see here, already generated 2 different codes for us and 85 different references. And so what that tells me is that in this interview, there's been 85 different times where, or we have like 85 different codes active already. And so if I go and click down here on this person, now I can see, okay, we have 43 references for Peter Maurer, 42 references for Heba Ali. Just very standard things, nothing, no real substance as of yet. The nice thing now is if I double click on Peter Maurer's name, I'm going to see all the references that of only Peter Maurer. And so I'm not seeing any of the questions that Heba is asking him. I'm not seeing any of the potential comments. And this becomes very nice as you go through the process of coding. Sometimes you want to limit the codes to only a specific group or a specific question. And so you can do this for questions as well. So nothing says that you can only autocode for a speaker's name. We could have replaced the speaker name, for example, with potentially what is the question being asked, and then be able to select on the question. So this is just kind of a nice way to kind of organize your data originally. Now, really, this is the bulk of NVIVO is what's called kind of these codes, and they're called. NVIVO likes to call codes, and what you call when you're coding for or looking for is nodes, because there are nodes in the data you're trying to make sense of and connect. And so in this case, this is kind of we have a blank sheet. We have no codes yet. We have no nodes, because this is a brand new document. And this is where your research is, and the research approach really is going to guide these next steps. And so oftentimes researchers will already have a sense of codes or things they want to look for in the documents that they're analyzing. And so if you're doing kind of this deductive approach, you might already have 10, 15, 20, 30 different things that you're interested in. And so NVIVO lets you do 2 different things. You can either code, we can either start adding codes here that we want to go and look for in the text, or we can start going through the text and coding, kind of building as we go. My approach, at least in my own research, has been taking more of a deductive approach. I had a list of things that I was looking for prior to, as I was conducting my interviews and data collection. And so I went through it from a deductive approach. So NVIVO lets you, add as many codes and nodes as you want. So what you would do is you would go in this function below, we would go and create a node. Again, nodes are kind of the codes, the large scale themes that you're looking for. In this case, I'm going to write, humanitarian reform as one, based on the fact that this is an interview with the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross. I'm going to add another code about humanitarian access, one of the things that the International Committee of Red Cross deals with or I'm interested in. We can also add a code for politics with humanitarian action. And really, for the purposes of this is just, we're just going to show you, I'm just going to go through and just show you kind of the process, and then I'll show you kind of some of the stuff that I've done just because it's already pre-populated. Now, the nice thing that I find about NVIVO that some of the other tools don't do as well is that you can build subcodes and have subcodes built in under a main code. And so for this example, we have a code that's humanitarian reform. I can go and create what's called a subform, subcode, and you would just click on, I would click back on humanitarian reform, click code, and let's say I'm interested about the localization agenda, which is a part of the humanitarian reform. You'll see that now we have this little code that we can choose from. And so anytime we're going to code for localization agenda, it's going to automatically also code for humanitarian reform. That's really nice when you're doing you want to kind of build through and go deeper into a specific issue. For example, Max QDA doesn't do this automatically, and you'd have to go and code back for the specific subcode or the parent code. And so let's do one more. And for example, politics of humanitarian, we can go create, we'll add another code and just say funding as kind of part of the politics of humanitarian action. And so we have a few already kind of codes that we can go through. And really now the process of coding is where it takes plenty of time. And you're going to have to do this, if you're doing this, you might have to code something multiple times because you can go through documents and say, and this is going to be based on not really reading the text at this moment, but let's say this is a paragraph where I think this is about humanitarian reform, based on my knowledge as a researcher, and I want to code this as humanitarian reform. What you would do is you would highlight the paragraph or the sentence or even a word if that's your approach to it. And then you can click Control F2, or if you click on this button, it's going to show you all the different codes that you have you can choose from. And so we're going to just go click on humanitarian reform, click OK. And now you'll see it's added on this kind of your box here. It shows you that in your repository, in your data, right now you have one file that has one reference to this code. I want to go through, for example, on the second one. And now you can also code by, if your preference is a little bit to do some things a little bit easier and quicker, you can also, sorry, NVIVO's a little glitchy sometimes. There we go. You can select this and then drag it to the code that you want to code for. And so let's say I want to code this for under localization agenda. Now you'll see under localization agenda, again, one file, one reference. What you can do, which is a nice part of NVIVO, is I can go and tell NVIVO now, okay, I want you to aggregate that anytime a code anytime a subcode of humanitarian reform gets coded, I want you to count it as a code for humanitarian reform as well. And so I would go and click on this kind of code, and then go all the way down to something called aggregate coding from children. The nice thing about NVIVO, again, versus something like Max QDA, is that I can turn this on and off. And so if I turn it on, it's going to boot again. And then now you'll see under humanitarian reform, we went from 1 to 2 because it's including the subcode for localization agenda as a humanitarian reform, because we already told the system to do this. If we don't want to count it, and there's multiple reasons you would want to do this depending on your research, and once you're done coding all these documents, you might want to look for things, and I'll show you in a little bit. You might want to look for things just on a subcode level and not have the parent code count. I can go back and just toggle this off without having to go back and code things. And so really, as you're doing this work and you go into NVIVO, it takes a lot of times when you're doing this manually, because you're going to go through sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, and oftentimes you go through this multiple times, and you're going to say, well, is this paragraph about humanitarian access or is this about reform? And you can code as many codes as you want. We can code the same paragraph, 20 different codes, 30 different codes, as long as it makes sense. Now, depending on your own research processes and your own methods, you may want to keep them separated. You may want to limit how many codes you do per sentence, per paragraph, or per idea, or per answer, for example, because it might make it easier for you as you go back through and then search for the codes. And so right now we only have one code for each, but one of the good things about NVIVO is that, let's say this has been 100 files and we've coded 1,000 references of humanitarian reform, and I want to go back and look at, okay, where are all the instances where something about humanitarian reform was set, or we coded for humanitarian reform. Well, it's very easy to pull all that information together really quickly in a very organized way in NVIVO. You would go for a look, and we would go and look at the nodes again. So we have this already open. And I say, I want to you can go and double click on this localization agenda, for example. And it's going to pull every reference that you've had already coded for localization agenda. And so you can have as many as you want, and you can look at it in a variety of different ways. On the right side here, you can have like a summary box, which shows you that in this source, we have one reference, and the coverage represents the percentage of the text coded as a percentage of the total text that exists in a document. And so we can see, for example, that already in this document, 1.5% of our text is talking about localization agenda. It's helpful for different varieties, and depending on your research, again, approach, it might be helpful to do this and then do comparisons. Because not only could you do, for example, break down things by person, we can break things down by organization as well, or any other form of classification. And so let's just go through real quick, and I'll show you an example. I'm going to take this PDF file that's about 40 or so pages by an organization called Humanitarian Policy Group, and I'm going to tell it I want to classify it as an organization. And so I would go and click on case classification. I would go type organization. Oops, sorry. I would click new classification. I would tell it, okay, use one of the already existing classification. And then it's added it down here. Sorry, I don't know why. In NVIVO, sometimes you have to do things multiple times for it to take on. There we go. You can right click, classification, organization, and then you give it a name. I'm going to say this is the Humanitarian Policy Group. And then it will generate typically the original attribute values. And again, we can add attributes to any of these cases as many times as we want. Right now it's unassigned. We'll just say Humanitarian Policy Group. We can organize it also by sector, the humanitarian sector, the size of the organization. You can say large, the industry, research. And so as you populate more and more of these things, then I can go back later on and just look for, organizations that only focus on research or large in size and pull documents from it. Again, I'm showing you just some of the stuff, and it'll make sense once we do a little bit more, and I'll show you some of my stuff, some of my research, because it's already pre-populated. Before we move on, I want to show you just, again, some of the autocode functions, and they work really nicely when it's large reports, because there's the way that reports are structured, the system can make sense of it a lot more easily. And so this is the report that we were interested in. Again, digital inclusion. And I can go back and say, under this PDF. Sorry, let me close out of some of the stuff up here. Okay. I can go back and click on it and say, there we go. autocode. And I can ask it to identify seams now. And the system will do it. And we'll click next. It's going to take a little bit of time to kind of the process. And one of the things to know about NVIVO, okay, the larger the files, the more time sometimes the process takes. And so it's already kind of identified a bunch of different seams for us. Age, data, humanitarian, technology approaches. It's not the best at identifying sometimes very micro things. And so this will give us kind of a broad overview of what the system has already identified. The autocode function is a newer feature. I personally wouldn't advise using it often. It might be helpful to do for a variety of, if you have 20 or so reports and you want to get a really macro level perspective on what are some of the key points. And again, we can ask it to code by sentences or paragraph. Let's just tell it paragraph because this will be a little bit easier and faster. And then it will store all the nodes, all the codes that it's developed. It'll store them under our node category. And so if we wanted to, we can also go back and code for just those specific ones. Click finish. It'll take a second just to kind of get coded. And you'll see now it's coded 1,087 references using 284 codes. And it gives us this nice kind of hierarchy of codes already. And so we can see, under humanitarian, we have humanitarian actors, settings, digital humanitarians. Under mapping, open source, processes, it's going through. And these are internal codes that the system using machine learning and natural processing language has developed. You can ask it for a summary, and you can again go through. It gets a little bit messy, but you can see that it's coded the term humanitarian 25 times, powerful aid, actors 13, etc. Going back here, you can also click on the mapping one, and you can see kind of a little bit more what are the different codes that it's coded for. I'm gonna switch gears real quickly and just show you, once you've coded dozens of interviews, what you can kind of show and showcase. And so I'm going to switch over to my own ongoing dissertation work and just show you just a snippet of what you can and cannot do. I won't show you text just because it's some of it's just sensitive information, but I'll show you aggregated codes just so you can see. And so this is already preloaded on my end. And so you'll see in my case, for example, these were already kind of my codes that I had developed in my research. There's about 9 different categories, and then I have subcodes that deal with different issues and different questions. Again, my files, my interview transcripts are already all preloaded, and you can see that kind of on a macro level, how many codes are used in each of these different interviews. Some interviews, might have different levels of codes depending on what the topic was or how much the interviewee referenced something that made sense for my own research, or something was a term that I was looking to code. And so once you've done the process really coding and going through details, you end up with a bunch of different functions that you can do and use. You can create charts, which can get a little bit messy when you're dealing with a lot of data in this case. And NVIVO is not the best, I'll say, at creating visualization. You can export kind of the results, for example, like this cross tabulation that I have. You can export it to an Excel and then use that, or use Excel or use Tableau or R to design nicer visuals. But just to show you kind of quickly, it might take a second to load. Okay. And so you can ask it to kind of cross-tabulate. In my case, I did this right before just to kind of have something to show. I asked NVIVO to cross-tabulate all my codes that have to do with data and digitalization, the stub codes, and then compare them with areas of work which in my case were 4 different categories. And what you can do is ask it for the count of how many files, for example, this has been referred to. It could be helpful, in my case, not necessarily. But then also you can see the percentages of how much of the text was broken or mentioned some of these issues out of this particular code. And so you can see, for example, there's a little bit of variety depending on how, depending on the sector. So these are people I spoke to. I interviewed, 6 people that work in academia, 14 who are practitioners, 10 who are NGOs, 5 in the private sector, or actually there's 5 only in this case. And this kind of shows you the breakdown of the coverage of the text based on my codes. And as I was telling you earlier, NVIVO is not the best at doing visualization. But if you really wanted to, it could look like something like this, which isn't the nicest way to showcase data, but it is a way, at least to get a sense. And so you can see, up there, we can kind of change the model. And these are just percentages of references based on, the people I spoke with, based on their own area of work. I can also add, if I want to look based on gender, I could do this as well. And I'm going to show you just briefly like how it really looks. If you're referencing everything, you can end up, in my case, I have about 80 or so different codes that I went through manually coding the different interviews, sentence by sentence. And from a macro level, it kind of looks something like this. 7.7% of all the text or interviews that I spoke with people in academia touched upon data and visualization. And these are just different percentages, and they vary depending on the sector. I want to be cognizant of time. I realize it's almost 12:35, and I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. I just wanted to show briefly that there's some of the very really basic functionalities of NVIVO. The other things you can do is you can choose, for example, to look at a specific type of code, and based on, for example, in my case, their area of work, I want to see if there's been a reference made to these codes. And for example, in my case here, let's see, no person from an INGO talked about repressive use of technology in my interviews, which is very interesting. That's an insight, actually, that none of them brought it up in my interviews, whereas people in the private sector have done so. But I'll go back to the original kind of document, just so we can kind of go from there. We can do more coding. The nice thing, and what I should have shown you, is you can color code as well. And so you can see, as you code things, you can go back and click on them and highlight, and you'll see this is the text that we coded as humanitarian reform. We can uncode it. We can go back and code over it and add, that this is about also humanitarian access, for example. And so you'll see that it's also coded now for humanitarian access here on the side. I hope this was at least somewhat of a helpful introduction. I'm happy to answer all the questions you may have. Let me pull up the chat and see if anything comes up. Okay. And so, yeah, Susan, I don't know if there's a process you'd like to take this forward. If you have any questions,
welcome any questions. People can either raise their hand or put a question in the chat. And if I could step back, Ziad, and ask you the first question, you sort of started to answer this just as you were saying, well, let me save some time for questions. And I was going to ask you about, can you give us an example of one of the insights that comes from using NVIVO rather than reading your material over and over and kind of, being engrossed with it and taking notes by hand or copy pasting things into a new document when they're on a certain theme. How have you seen NVIVO give you insights that you wouldn't have noticed before? And what you just mentioned a moment ago is, no one from an INGO mentioned this particular theme about repressive use of technology.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was. So
Right. Yeah.
can you give us some of those examples and let us know, like, in your experience, would you suggest this is worth using and why? And then is there anything you're missing by this? Like, do you augment this with also reading through the stuff in a free
Yeah.
form way and engrossing yourself in it and so forth?
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question. And I'll say I'll give you another example about things that I was shocked when I was looking over my data after I interviewed people, is that I noticed that there was a lot more concern about data responsibility coming from people who are from the private tech sector versus people in academia, which I thought might have been a little bit different. Also, you know, one of the things that you're touching upon is also, Susan, is that the reality is this is a finite sample of people. And so I think adding to this is also obviously very important. But I think it was interesting enough that, out of the 6 people, both in academia and the private sector, that work on this stuff, that I interviewed, that really data responsibility came out a lot, actually a lot more in the private sector than it did as a percentage of my text than it did from most other people, although everybody got to ask the same set of questions. And so everybody had the same opportunities to respond and talk about a specific issue. And so that was a nice way. The other nice way was to able just to really be able to go back and forth versus kind of a traditional PDF. I love highlighting PDFs, copy pasting. But when you're doing this with dozens and dozens and dozens of documents, you kind of lose a little bit of, not track, but it gets a lot harder to be able to make sense of it. One of the nice things about NVIVO is that I can't show you because my files, but it's just nice to be able to click and say, let me just go back and look at everything that's about the specific issue, and then be able to also narrow it down. Let me look at everything that people in the private sector told me about data responsibility. And then let me go through this text again and see, oh, well, this is interesting. They're talking about this in a language of liability. They're not really talking about data responsibility in the sense of protection of civilians or protection of people in potential harm, versus when other people are talking about this in this way, well, they really mean something else. And just being able to toggle back and forth in a faster way is nice. I'll say it's been really good also to be able to just kind of narrow down and just be able to pull things in small pieces, one bit at a time, especially as I'm writing the dissertation and I'm particularly interested. I'm writing a paragraph where I'm like, oh, I really need to get a better sense of these private sector interests in partnering with the humanitarian sector. I know I asked a question about this. I know I have a few codes about this. Let me go back and pull these quotes, these references in my interviews, and make sense of it, and be able to then go back and even, sometimes you'll take a quote and just put it in dissertation, or just say, X percentage of people interviewed have brought this issue up, or 7 people have brought this up. It really is a nice way to kind of organize. One of the other feature that NVIVO does, which is kind of a nice way, is you can do what they call, you can build, you can build these things called mind maps, and let's just call it NVIVO Monday for our sake, where I can go through and just kind of type up different ideas. Let's say reform, and I want to write like a child idea, something related to reform, issues of funding, and then be able to also, as you're coding, be able to have these kind of memos to yourself that you can go back through and sorry, and look at. It's really helpful in that way to have everything kind of centralized. And on that note, please make sure to save. One of maybe a little bit of a downfall of NVIVO is that it doesn't do automatic saving. You actually have to keep going through and saving it will remind you every 15 minutes that you haven't saved. But that's one of that's a negative kind of features of it. It doesn't have an autosave function. Nothing worse than spending your whole day coding one interview and your computer's battery running out, and then you losing 8 hours of work, or your data gets corrupted. And so when you save it, also highly recommend you save it and make copies of it like daily, and save it somewhere else. I save everything to a cloud, to my computer, to a USB. I've been in situations where I've lost like days worth of work, and it's not fun having to go back. And again, I think one of the other nice things is, in this case, I like color-coded things, and so it's nice to be able to have it be able to show you things in color sometimes, and be able to go through and the nice thing is able to go through and kind of add things after you've already done some of the work. And so if I go through now in my interviews and say, well, I want to look for this specific issue and see where it is and be able to go and add it, it will automatically kind of reformulate all the numbers. It will fit in nicely. Let's say it's a subcode under these categories, and I can go back and search for it. When you're copy pasting or highlighting on a PDF, sometimes it becomes very cumbersome.
Yep.
And this is definitely, NVIVO, I'll say, is a very manual process. It takes a lot of time. One of the things as a qualitative researchers, we all know, like, our biases kick in, and having to kind of step back and just check, in a way, check yourself about the biases as you're coding is important, which is why I think I said early on, you will end up coding these things multiple times. And every time you go through, you're going to find a new iteration. You say, oh, well, I'm not sure this is talking about this issue, actually about this, and be able to go through and change that code, or change the way you coded it, and have it automatically to help you with this and help organize it, is a benefit. Really, NVIVO goes back to, I think it's a way to help organize your analysis, organize some of your coding, but it's still very much up to the researcher to be able to make sense of things, and it just helps you dive into some of these some of your research a little bit more. It's not a model, it's not a quantitative model that's going to tell you, well, these are correlated, or there's statistical significance. There's still a lot on the user, on the researcher, which I personally like, and I think it's important in this case.
So I don't see anyone else raising hands, but I invite you all to either raise your hand or put a question in chat. Ziad, I wonder if you are able to tell us, are there any opportunities for multiple researchers to collaborate using NVIVO so that you could have multiple coders, multiple people working with the same material, each contributing to the coding?
So there is some ways to do so, and there's ways to also you can share the file. It's unfortunately, from my understanding, NVIVO doesn't let multiple people at the same time code on the same file. But what you can do is, let's say I coded a document, I can send it to you, Susan. When you open it and start coding it, NVIVO is also going to recognize this is a new user. And so what we can do is, you and I and Audra and Jeff can code the same document. And then there's ways to kind of look at comparisons and do kind of inter-rater operability, and look for mismatches or matches, and be able to say, well, we coded this document 96% the same way. Let's go look at those per percent and look at those differences.
Nice.
It's a little bit, it still requires a lot of manual work, but there is different ways to do so using NVIVO. I'll make a quick note that the University Digital Research Center has a lot of great resources on NVIVO. They even sometimes offer classes that you can sign up, or if there's enough interest, I think you need about 3 people. They will come and develop a class for you. They might give you a 2 or 3 hour lecture or session on a specific issue in NVIVO, if you plan it ahead.
Great, thank you. And just George Mason University, my understanding is we at the Carter School don't have access to NVIVO unless we buy our own subscriptions to it.
That's true.
Currently.
Currently, you could get, which is what I did, a student/academic license for 2 years. It's about $90 for NVIVO 12 Plus, which is the premium version. And NVIVO 12 regular is about $80. It's only about $10 or $12 of a difference. It's the license for 24 months. You get to have it on 2 different computers. And so I'm sitting at George Mason at the desk that I'm assigned to. I have it on my computer here, and I have it also on my desktop. And so you can have 2 different devices at the same time. we used to be able to have access through it through the virtual computing lab, but that got they got rid of it at some point at the end of 2020, which is unfortunate. But it's relatively, cheaper than a lot of the alternative, I'll say. And there's a lot of support for NVIVO, just because it's it's used in a lot of organizations, a lot of qualitative researchers use it. The entity that owns the software, blank on their name, but they do a lot of tutorials. If you go on their website, there's a lot of different videos. And
called you yesterday, but I just missed my meeting.
Yeah.
I see Ashton's hand is up.
Oh, that's a
Ashton.
big mug. It's almost like a bucket.
Okay, well, I'm going to try and mute someone who's talking about a mug, if I can figure out who that is. But meanwhile, let's go to Ashton.
Thank you very much. Sorry for any background noise. I'm out running a quick errand, but thank you for that presentation. You mentioned that most of the time you create codes going into it, having a sense of what you want to do. And you might have covered this, but what, if you have gone through a process where you let codes emerge naturally through your analysis, how do you, is there an easy way that you found to go back and recode without taking forever? Or how would you think about doing that?
That's a really good question. So it's going to really depend on what the code is. And I think my quick answer is you probably would still want to go back and recode. So if there's a new code that emerges, the challenge of doing this work manually and all of this and really qualitative work is that you're going to end up going back and having to recode things. There is ways, for example, if you go through and you found that every time there's a mention of funding or a reference to funding, they're also talking about politics, or they're also talking about access. There is ways to kind of, I guess, code for a new code based on the existing code, but you still would want to double check that that's truly the case. That's why I said this takes a lot of time, and just coding 35 interviews took about 3 months. Took about like the whole summer going through and multiple iterations of it, and then realizing that, well, actually what I coded a month ago, I need to go back and recode a section of it.
Ziad, related to that, I wanted to ask about, I'm thinking about particular research I did where first, as I was reading through the interviews, I was coding things as it's about coordination between conflict resolution efforts. And then as I went through, I realized, there are these different kinds of coordination.
Yeah.
And so what I had to do many decades ago, when there was not NVIVO yet, is I had to go back through everything and look manually at all the places I'd said were coordination with my colored coded markers and figure out which kind of coordination they were.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking NVIVO would have helped me pull up all the coordination ones and look at them together and distinguish between the different types of coordination that I was noticing. Yeah, I see there's a question also in the chat too, so I'll stop talking and let you address what Ashton and I have said, and also this question in the chat.
Okay, yeah, so presentation written, yeah, so you could, if I don't have an interview right now in Arabic, but from my understanding, you would be able to pull up a text in Arabic right here and code it. I'm not sure if you could completely, like the way Office does, switch everything to Arabic, but you'd be able to pull up a PDF that's in Arabic and code it. And then yes, you'd also need to use the website capture to pull up videos from YouTube, unless you already downloaded the videos. And there is also a way, they have a social media, and this is kind of some of the features that are more advanced that I don't use my own work. But there is ways to kind of collect social media feeds, so you would be able to do kind of store and analyze, millions of tweets or thousands of tweets from a specific account. There is, when you go to NCapture, you'd be able to kind of import, if you already downloaded kind of social media data sets, there is ways to do this. That's one of the social network features that they increasingly are promoting as part of like their new packages for NVIVO. It might take a little bit of time and tweaking on your end, but from my understanding, you'd be able to pull, and they would all be added to kind of like your data, your file, probably under like externals, and then you'd be able to go through it and code them, one by one, or auto code. One of the things that NVIVO does as well is in addition to identifying coding by themes, you can also do by sentiment. And so you can look for patterns if this is like a positive sentiment or negative sentiment. It does it to different variation. And then one of the other things, which is still kind of a newer feature, is that let's say you've coded 20 different interviews, you can ask NVIVO to go through and code another set of 20 based on the coding pattern and using only the codes that you already established for those first 20. It's okay as a system. I've tried it for some of my interviews early on, just as a case study, just to get a better sense. I coded 10 and then asked it to code the next 10. It's okay. It's not great. You can get some insights. I wouldn't say it's still not to the level of being able to do this well enough. And you probably maybe needed 100, 200, 300 interviews ahead of time to have a larger sample for it to be able to reliably code. There's other things you can do. You can do some statistical analysis later on. You can do correlations, a little wonky and too advanced maybe just to show, but you can do kind of a Pearson correlation between, well, anytime there's a mention or this correlation between like funding and access or digitalization and politics. You can do some of the statistical analysis and it gives you kind of a different correlation matrices, and which could be helpful depending on your approach and your method.
Thank you. Well, as we come towards the end of this hour, if I could ask kind of one step back and reflect question, is there anything that you would advise people who are considering using NVIVO in their qualitative research? Any cautions you would offer people? Like if you're considering this, obviously it's worked for you, but you want people to go in with their eyes open about these particular challenges or constraints of it.
Yeah, I mentioned it already, but it's worth taking note. The time. There's no shortcut. This takes time. This takes a lot of work and a lot of manual labor. My warning is that I started coding and then realized I just didn't have the right coding structure. I was going through a combination of preset codes and new codes, and I coded a few interviews, and then realized I have to go back. It's good to have a sense before going in the approach you're going to take. Before diving, I think my advice is that. Obviously, NVIVO makes it a little bit easier to kind of switch and do this, but that's one thing. Obviously, I didn't realize how horrible the visualization of some of this stuff is. NVIVO is definitely not meant to be a visualization tool, not for the way we as researchers in conflict resolution code and do things. So it's not very customizable. So like sometimes you can't code for you can't show multiple codes on the same graph. You have to export everything to Excel and do it there, which is a shame. There's a little bit of also the system itself. There's these differences between matrices and crosstabs. It could be confusing when you're like trying to aggregate the final data after you've coded everything, and sometimes it works and you can get it to do certain things. So it's by no means the perfect way of organizing. I don't think there's a perfect system out there for qualitative research, or actually any system out there for any kind of research. But also just be aware that there's a lot of limitations on some of the how much time it takes. It takes a lot of tweaking and trial by error in many cases, which is why it's important to save and have multiple copies, so that if you do something that fatally damages your files, you have a safe copy to go back to. I uncoded about 7 interviews early on in the summer by mistake, and it overruled it. Like they got saved over, and I panicked for a minute, but thankfully I had things on my USB saved. So I'd say just be aware. It's good to also spend time, read some of the tutorials that are online to see what you can and cannot do with NVIVO. I use another software with Professor Simmons called Leximancer. That one is a lot different. That one really is a very much machine learning, natural processing language software that can go through thousands of files, identify themes really, really well, and connections between different ideas and semantic analysis. But it doesn't do the nitty gritty stuff. And so you have to kind of pick your battle. You can obviously use both. Leximancer is very expensive, fortunately, which is a downside of it. But it's really, if you're going to do 300 different interviews, NVIVO is going to take you forever. And so just be aware that, this is a very manual process. It takes a long time, especially, as you're doing like hour-long interviews or 2-hour-long interviews. It's going to take you, I don't know, X times that amount of days to just go through it, at least do it well. But it helps organize things. I definitely recommend using some of the, where are they? Those, concept maps and project maps if you do it. There's different things you can do as kind of, cluster analyses and look for clusters of your codes, how they interconnect. Again, depending on what you're interested in, they could be helpful. You can do, this was the coding reference earlier, Susan. You can do the coding comparison between, multiple users. You can look to user A and B.
Yep.
Well,
thank you. You've emphasized the time it takes to do this work and to do it well. And I really want to thank you for your time, sharing your expertise that you've developed through, by doing this work. And thank you for taking your time to share that with us and to everyone else who will be eventually watching the video, because I think this is going to be one of the popular ones because you've been so detailed about kind of the how-tos and the overview introduction, and then people can follow up with particular tutorials on specific issues. But I really want to thank you so much, Ziad. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'm going to put my email in the chat if anybody has questions. I'm happy to help answer or help guide in the right way.
Great. Thank you so
Susan.
much. Thanks everyone for coming. Bye-bye.